We're pawnbrokers that happen to be on TV. The uniqueness of our situation is the American Jewelry and Loan business. We're a pawn shop. We deal with 1,000 people that come in to borrow money every day, and that's what drew attention to our store.
For years, Les Gold was the unstoppable force behind hardcore pawn. The man who turned a struggling Detroit shop into one of America's most watched reality empires. His sharp negotiation skills, fearless personality, and no-nonsense approach made him a household name. Whether he was dealing with desperate customers, massive jewelry deals, or explosive arguments inside American Jewelry and Loan, Les always looked like someone who could never be shaken. But behind the confidence and the cameras was a businessman who carried the weight of his entire legacy on his shoulders. One that is now collapsing in ways fans never expected. In recent months, shocking reports have surfaced that Les Gold has lost almost everything he spent a lifetime building. The empire he protected with his bare hands is crumbling, and insiders say the situation is far worse than the public realizes. From financial setbacks to heartbreaking personal events, Les has been hit from every direction, leaving him facing the most devastating chapter of his life. It all started quietly, small signs that most people ignored: a sudden absence from public events, rumors that the pawn shop was facing serious trouble, employees whispering that the business wasn't what it used to be. But now, the truth has finally surfaced, and it is nothing short of heartbreaking. After decades of fighting to keep his family business alive, Les is standing face to face with a loss so massive, even he couldn't negotiate his way out of it. Fans are now asking the same haunting question: how did the strongest man in the pawn world lose everything he spent his entire life trying to protect? Long before television cameras followed him around the chaotic floors of American Jewelry and Loan, Les Gold was already a legend in Detroit. His journey into the pawn world wasn't something he stumbled into, it was in his blood. Born into a family of pawnbrokers, Les grew up surrounded by the clinking of jewelry, the murmurs of negotiations, and the constant struggle to keep a small business alive in one of America's toughest cities. By the time he was a teenager, he wasn't just helping around the shop, he was learning how to survive in a world where every transaction carried a story, a risk, and a lesson. Les's rise began with something simple: determination. Detroit wasn't an easy place to build an empire, especially during times when the economy offered more challenges than opportunities. But Les refused to give up. He took the family pawn business and expanded it with a vision that few could understand at the time. He didn't just want a shop, he wanted a destination, a place where people from all walks of life could walk in with a story and walk out with a deal. By the early 2000s, his hard work was becoming impossible to ignore. American Jewelry and Loan wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Lines stretched out the door, and customers came from every corner of Detroit, drawn by the promise of fast cash and fair negotiation. But along with legitimate clients came drama, conflict, and some of the wildest moments imaginable. Buyers argued, sellers shouted, and emotions ran high, and Les stood in the center of it all, calm yet fierce, never losing control no matter how chaotic things became. Everything changed in 2010 when Hardcore Pawn premiered on television. Overnight, Les Gold became a national sensation. Viewers were captivated not just by the deals and the drama, but by Les's personality: firm, fearless, and unapologetically honest. His ability to stay composed in the loudest moments made him a fan favorite, and soon millions were tuning in every week to watch him and his family navigate the unpredictable pawn world. The show transformed his life. The shop expanded, business skyrocketed. Tourists traveled from across the country just to take pictures with the Gold family. Les began doing book signings, interviews, and speeches. His name became synonymous with Detroit hustle and American determination. He didn't just run a pawn shop, he ran a cultural phenomenon. But success always comes with a price, and Les felt it: the pressure to keep the show exciting, the responsibility of keeping the business running smoothly, and the weight of being a public figure took a toll on him. Still, he powered through. Despite the stress, despite the challenges, he remained the face of an empire that seemed stronger than ever. Behind the scenes, however, fault lines were forming. that fans never saw on television. The pawn industry was changing, competition was growing, and the financial landscape of Detroit was shifting yet again. Slowly, the empire that once looked unshakable began to face cracks. But during the height of hardcore pawn, Les believed he could handle anything for years. He maintained that belief. He had built an empire with his bare hands, and he felt confident that no challenge was too big for him to overcome. He had survived economic downturns, personal conflicts, and relentless pressure, and yet, what was coming next would be unlike anything he had ever faced. Les Gould's rise was extraordinary, but the fall that followed would be far more shocking. The man who once never flinched in the face of chaos was about to be hit with a storm powerful enough to destroy everything he had worked for his entire life. The first signs of trouble didn't come with a dramatic collapse or a public announcement. Instead, they arrived quietly, small shifts in the business that most people would have overlooked. But to someone like Les Gould, who spent his entire life reading situations the way others read books, these changes carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Still, with decades of experience behind him, he believed the storm was temporary. Unfortunately, this time he was wrong. It began when Detroit's economic landscape shifted faster than expected. While the city was beginning to rebuild, the pawn industry was being hit from the opposite direction. Online resale platforms, digital lenders, and a new wave of competition had begun swallowing the customer base that once relied exclusively on pawn shops. Even loyal customers were now turning to apps and websites where prices were lower, fees were newer, and convenience was unmatched. Les knew the pawn business would eventually change, but he hadn't expected it to happen so suddenly. Inside American Jewelry and Loan, longtime employees sensed the tension. Revenue wasn't what it used to be. Deals were getting smaller, customers were becoming fewer, and overhead costs were increasing. Les tried everything: new promotions, updated marketing, improved customer experience, but it felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Every effort bought him time, but not stability. Then came the second blow: internal disputes. Running a family business is never simple, and as the years went on, disagreements between Les and certain staff members began rising to the surface. Some employees, frustrated with long hours and declining profits, chose to walk away. Others stayed, but complained that the business was changing too fast for comfort. The energy inside the shop, once vibrant and lively, now felt heavy and uncertain. But the hardest shift came when the cameras stopped rolling, when hardcore pawn ended. It took with it millions of viewers, constant publicity, and the steady stream of tourists who brought business every single day. The show had transformed the pawn shop into an attraction. Without it, the foot traffic dropped dramatically. Regular customers remained, but the spark that once kept the business booming had dimmed. As if the financial strain wasn't enough, Les faced personal stress that weighed on him even more heavily. The pressure to keep his legacy intact seemed to grow with each passing month. For a man who had built everything from nothing, the thought of losing control over his life's work was devastating. He spent sleepless nights analyzing numbers, calling advisors, and trying to find a solution that didn't involve downsizing the empire he had spent decades creating. Then came the third and perhaps most devastating blow: a major financial setback that blindsided him. While the exact details remain private, insiders say a combination of investment losses and legal challenges created a massive financial hole, the kind of hole that would take years or perhaps a miracle to recover from. Even for someone as tough as Les, this was a hit he couldn't simply negotiate his way out of. Rumors started circulating among Detroit locals. People whispered that the business wasn't stable. Some claimed the shop might close. Others believed Les was planning to sell everything. None of these rumors were confirmed, but the fear behind them was real. And inside the Gould family, those fears were amplified. They were now facing a reality they never imagined: the possibility of losing the empire that had defined their lives. Emotionally, the strain became too much. For the first time, Les began questioning whether he still had the strength to fight through another battle. He wasn't just older, he was tired. Decades of stress, limited sleep, and constant pressure had finally taken a toll. His health was no longer something he could ignore, and the emotional weight of watching his life's work slip away was heartbreaking. The downfall had begun, slow but unstoppable, and the man who once seemed unbreakable was now facing the greatest challenge of his entire life. The moment everything truly collapsed didn't come with loud headlines or a dramatic announcement. It happened quietly, almost painfully so, like watching a strong foundation weaken one brick at a time. For Les Gold, the man who once stood like an iron wall behind American jewelry and loan, the downfall felt surreal. He had survived recessions, business rivals, lawsuits, even the pressures of reality television. But what he faced now was something far bigger, far more personal, and far more heartbreaking. The financial hole he had been trying to patch for months finally grew too large to control. Rising operational costs, loss of steady customers, and the absence of TV-driven traffic put enormous pressure on the business. Les poured his savings into keeping the shop alive, refusing to let go of the empire he had built with his own hands. But every time he managed to fix one problem, 3 more appeared. Even the most loyal employees sensed the shift. Sales were dropping, inventory was shrinking, and tension hung in the air like a dark cloud. The hardest moment came when Les was forced to make a decision he had never imagined: closing one of the major sections of the store. For decades, that space had been filled with jewelry, electronics, tools, and items from families across Detroit. Now, it stood empty. The lights were off. The counters were covered. It was a physical reminder of just how much had been lost. Employees who had worked there for years had tears in their eyes as they packed boxes and cleaned out storage rooms. For them, this shop wasn't just a job, it was a second home. Watching it shrink felt like saying goodbye to a part of themselves. But Les wasn't just losing space, he was losing people. Some employees, faced with financial uncertainty, began looking for work elsewhere. A few left quietly, unable to watch the shop crumble. Others stayed out of loyalty, hoping Les could still pull off a miracle like he had so many times before. But even they could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he carried in every step. The man who once commanded the busiest pawn shop in Detroit now felt like he was fighting a war he could no longer win. The emotional toll grew heavier when Les discovered that several long-term investments meant to secure his retirement had failed. What had taken decades to build was now disappearing at rapid speed. Financial advisors warned him that recovery might be impossible. The safe future he had envisioned for his family was suddenly at risk, and for the first time in his career, the thought of losing everything became a haunting reality. To make matters worse, the Gold family faced a wave of personal setbacks during the same period. The stress of the business collapse created tension at home. Every conversation, every decision, every late-night call revolved around one terrifying question: what happens if the shop goes under? Even those closest to Les felt helpless, watching the strongest man they knew crumble under a pressure no one could relieve. Then came the final blow, the moment that confirmed the nightmare he had tried so hard to avoid. Les was informed that key business debts could no longer be delayed. He would have to sell major portions of the company assets. Years of hard work, priceless collectibles, treasured shop equipment, everything had to go. Auction trucks were scheduled. Notices were posted. The world he had spent his entire life building was officially slipping out of his control. On the morning the liquidation began, Les arrived at the shop early. He walked through the halls, past empty counters and silent offices, remembering the crowds, the laughter, the chaos, the energy that once made the place feel alive. Now, all he heard was the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of movers loading items onto trucks. It felt like attending a funeral for his own life's work. For the first time in decades, Les stood alone in the center of the shop, emotionally drained, financially broken, and heartbroken beyond words. The empire that once seemed indestructible had finally collapsed, and with it, Les Gold lost not just a business, but a piece of himself. After the empire collapsed, Les Gold entered the most difficult phase of his life. For decades, he had been known as the man who never broke, the man who could survive any crisis with grit and determination. But now, without the bustling shop, without the cameras, without the constant rhythm of business guiding his days, Les found himself in unfamiliar territory, quiet, empty, and deeply uncertain. The world he had built was gone, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. At first, he struggled to adjust. Waking up without the pressure of running American Jewelry and Loan felt strange. The routine that had defined him for his entire life had vanished overnight. He missed the customers, the negotiations, the chaos, the personalities, and even the heated confrontations that had once filled his days with energy. More than anything, he missed the purpose. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a fighter, a hustler, a symbol of Detroit resilience. And now he wondered if that part of him still existed. But slowly, Les began to rebuild not a business, but himself. Friends and family encouraged him to take a break, something he had never allowed himself to do. For the first time in years, he began focusing on things outside of work: long walks, quiet mornings, time with loved ones, a little travel, and even reconnecting with hobbies he had abandoned decades ago. It wasn't easy. Letting go of the identity he had carried since he was a kid felt like losing a part of his soul, but he pushed forward, determined not to let this downfall define the rest of his life. Those close to him say that despite losing everything, Les's spirit didn't disappear, it simply changed shape. Instead of negotiating behind the counter, he started using his experience in new ways. He began giving small seminars, sharing lessons from his life and business, teaching people the importance of resilience, negotiation, and financial survival. Surprisingly, these events became popular. People still wanted to hear from the legendary pawnbroker who had seen it all. His voice carried wisdom that only comes from decades of surviving real-world struggles financially. He is no longer the powerhouse he once was, but he isn't destitute either. Through careful planning, downsizing, and support from those close to him, Les stabilized his life. He now lives more modestly, focusing on personal peace instead of public success. The flashy world of TV fame and massive business operations no longer interests him. Instead, he values simplicity, something he never had the chance to appreciate before. Emotionally, the journey has been the hardest. Losing the shop wasn't just a financial loss, it was the loss of a dream, a legacy, and a lifelong identity. There are days when the weight of it hits him all over again. But those who know him say he has found a sense of acceptance. He understands that life changes, businesses fall, and even the strongest empires collapse. What matters is how a person moves forward after everything has been taken from them. As for the future, Les remains surprisingly hopeful. He has hinted at writing another book, this time not about business success, but about surviving failure. He's also considered returning to TV, not for a reality show, but for a documentary-style project that tells the truth about the rise and fall of American Jewelry and Loan. Fans would finally see the full story, the victories, the losses, the heartbreak, and the rebuilding. Most importantly, Les now focuses on something he never had enough time for: living. No stress, no deals, no cameras, just life. After decades of non-stop pressure, he is finally breathing freely. The man who once believed that losing everything would destroy him has discovered a new truth. Sometimes life takes everything away to give you something better: clarity, peace, and a chance to start again. Les Gold may have lost his empire, but he didn't lose himself. And in many ways, that's the greatest victory of his life.